I think we all got chills. So thank you, Lance. First of all, thank all of you for being here and for sharing your stories. And as I said at the top, you each bring such a different perspective and different sort of nuance to the conversation that we're having. And so it's an honor for me to share stage time with you. So thank you. I also want to go back to something I said at the top, which is that I really do feel that we live in a time of contrast, and I think all of you have gotten to this in your remarks. And Laverne, I want to start by asking you about something that you mentioned in your remarks about, contrasting being on the cover of Essence and Time magazine with the state of emergency that exists in the community. How do you square those realities? How do we live in a time where both of those things are possible at the same time? And for you, how are you using your influence and your voice and sort of the power of your presence to change the conversation?
Oh gosh, I can't help it. The funny thing is, I think about, there was a moment 2.5 years ago, it was 2012, in February, and this is before I booked Orange is the New Black, and I was working in a restaurant in New York City, called Lucky Chang's, a drag queen restaurant. A lot of trans women work in the context of drag, those of us who have performance backgrounds and fine arts, screen dance. And so I was working there, and I was working there a couple of days a week and pursuing my acting career, going on auditions and doing advocacy work. And that month, I didn't have my rent. And I was very late with my rent. And I got an eviction notice, and I had to go to housing court, which is the second time in my life that had happened. And it was, it's a really painful thing to talk about, and I don't like to talk about it. And I have a lot of shame around that too. The fact that I'm working and I have a college degree and I can't pay my rent this month. What has gone wrong in my life? And I sort of got on a payment plan for my rent. And when I booked Orange is the New Black later that year, by November, it was the first time that year that it was the first of the month, and my rent was paid. And that was a really amazing feeling. And so I feel very just lucky. I know sort of like, how did this happen? That, I feel very blessed that the first of the month comes and I have my rent. And I know that I understand that I'm very lucky that I booked this job on this show that has totally changed my life. And it's been a little bit over a year. So I think about that, and then I think about I'm not so far removed from being one of those trans folks out there, trans women of color, who is struggling to pay their rent if they are lucky enough to have a place to live at all. And I think that I got lucky, and I've worked very hard too. I'm gonna, but I think that we have symbols in this country. I think about Jason Collins being the first openly gay person to compete in a team sport, gay man. And we have these, or President Barack Obama being the first black president. So we have these symbols, but that these symbols do not mean that these systems that we exist under are being dismantled. Right? And so I think that is so important when I use that term, imperialist, cisnormative, heteronormative, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, that these systems are all sort of working together to keep us down. And I think we can use these symbols of, Laverne Cox on the cover of this magazine, Laverne Cox is successful, and say that, we don't have to do the work still. I think that is about dismantling the systems. And even I think about this, places like Chicago House, which has been doing vital work for so many years, and this sort of space of philanthropy, which is actually really crucial to the fight. But I think that while the philanthropy is important, that we also have to dismantle these systems. And when we do the work, as I said, when we're engaged in this work, so many of us can bring our own biases to it. I have to work to interrogate white supremacy in my life, and the white supremacist thinking that I might have, or the cisnormative thinking that I might have, or the ableist thinking. I'm rambling a little bit. But I met this amazing young trans person by the name of Hayden Crystal last weekend in Missouri, and they said to me that they're deaf, and we were talking, and Hayden was like, said to me that the importance of the intersectional piece between a person who is trans and disabled is so important. And Hayden said to me, when I was harassed and threatened when I was in my freshman year of college, it wasn't because I was deaf or wasn't because I was trans, it was because I was at the intersection of both those things. And so it's so important for us as we do this work to acknowledge how these things work with each other. Because I think too, as I think about, I'm finally able to pay my rent and I'm not like financially, hard out at the moment. And I think, oh my God, I've gotten here, I should not talk about white supremacy, I should not use that phrase. I should not talk about poor people, I should toe the line and try to be a good little girl and not say what I think needs to be said. And I think that's how these forces work with each other to keep us from doing the work that we really have to do.
So let's build. Let's build up this last piece of what you just said about intersectionality, which is not just a buzzword, but it's about people's lives. And Jason, we were talking a little bit about, and you did as well in your remarks, about coming out and what was that like, and in all the various sort of communities that you belong to. So talk to us a little bit about what it was like for you, and what I'd really love to know is what was most surprising for you.
It's a two-part, but coming out, got a lot of support from a lot of my NBA family, my friends, a lot of people in public eye. President Obama giving me a call. Somehow he found had my cell phone number. He's the president. And the person right before him who called was Oprah Winfrey, and somehow she also. But it was an amazing experience to come out and play last year. My teammates, I played 13 years in the NBA, 12 of which I was in the closet. Last year I was out. But in the locker room, you hear language, you hear homophobic language being used. And some of the players who I heard using certain words, once I came out, they reached out to me, called me, and expressed their support. And some of them apologized, because sometimes people use words and there's a lack of awareness, or they just don't know, they're not educated about how it affects your teammates or someone who you don't think is in the room. There was one player on my team, it was after my second game, he pulled me aside on the team plane and was like, Jason, this is going to be huge. I'm so glad that you're with the team. I'm so glad you're back in the league. And it means a lot to me to have my teammates support me. And it just shows that professional athletes, a lot of us, it comes down to, can you help the team win? A lot of us, growing up in team sports, learn about sacrifice and also learn about bringing all kinds of different people together. In sports, your race, religion. I've had teammates from foreign countries, and of course they teach you the bad words in their country, in their language. But sports is about bringing people together. And another, which leads to the second part of your question, the most surprising thing for me was connecting with a church that, again, brings people together. I always grew up in a religious household. My grandmother is from upstate Louisiana, deep south, and she's one of those women that, she'll have a belt in one hand, a Bible in the other when she leaves us. And but her love for me, when I came out, when I told her, she's like, you're my grandson, and I love you, I support you, and it doesn't matter to me. I was always a little hesitant of connecting with a church. I always believed, I was very spiritual and believe in God, but sometimes I think the messenger, sometimes the preacher, that's where I would have the issue. And the most surprising thing was finding a church in Los Angeles where it really is about love, it really is about community, and come as you are. And I think far too often in this country, around the world, people use religion as a way to divide and to exclude people. And to me, that's not what religion is about. So I think we need to continue to support those organizations, those people that are bridge builders. And, again, that's how you will effectively change people's hearts and minds.
And I think there's a common thread here, obviously, Southern roots with all of you. And Lance, I would love to hear about your trip, because you just it's fresh now for you. What did you hear when you were down there? What was surprising to you? What's your takeaway?
On the South, it's really fresh, because I got on a plane from Memphis at like 4:30 this morning. I'm not so fresh. The trip was I'm sorry, Albert.
The camera's not seeing you.
You look good from here. You smell good too.
So we did, I'm sorry, this is awesome. We were doing these community forums because it was about conversation building, about having the conversations that we hope with investments from different organizations will lead to the institutions that they need in the South. Do you know how many institutions there are that are aimed at protecting LGBT people, if you add them all up, in Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas? Anybody? It's real easy math because it's 0. None. Yeah. And so we start talking. First of all, the fact that these people even come out, some of them are shaking. They're very nervous because it's been in the paper, there's a little press there. This is definitely coming out for a lot of these young people, families, older couples. You get it all. And we start having the conversations about what they are looking for, what they need. Marriage. They're not thinking about marriage. They're barely thinking about housing and employment, although that's a concern. Number one concern, physical safety, personal safety. Preach, right? And so we're starting to make sure that we have the institutions in place that can protect them if they are attacked, that make sure that their cases are looked into. That's the other thing. I mean, even if, and so much of the crime goes unreported, but even when reported in the South, it's not looked into, particularly with the trans community. And so, you know, these are the stories I was hearing, and it was just time after time after time breaking my heart. And you look at the numbers, and it starts to make sense. If across the country now, which is really amazing, and really a credit to the thousands upon thousands of acts of bravery that people do every day, which is called coming out, that now 90% of folks along the coasts know someone who is LGBT. In the South, that number drops to 50% who think they know someone who's LGBT. That's why it's not moving. That's why minds aren't changing. And so, you know, it's people living in silence, people living in isolation still, and figuring out how to get into that. I mean, it's really back in time there. So I often say, like Utah is interesting because it has a place called Salt Lake City where the young people started to come, and they now LGBT people have built a critical mass there that looks a lot like, say, San Francisco or New York in the 70s. They know that there are other people like them, and they're starting to organize. In the South, they're not even sure that there's other people out in their communities like them. And what makes it, and so we're talking about like the 40s. We're talking about what it looked like in San Francisco in the 40s when blue slip soldiers were just being kicked out of the military, drafted boys were being kicked out of the military for being gay. And for the first time, they can't go home, they got a blue slip, right? They got to stay in San Francisco, they can't get a job, it's a mental illness, it's a felony in most of their hometowns. And for the very first time, they're meeting other people like them. And that's what's happening in the South right now. Is for the first time, people are stepping out and meeting people very much like them. And we have to continue to let that happen, because that's how the critical mass builds, that's how you start to build political power. And most importantly, and I'll end there, is the really critical work which is going on between the LGBT community, the racial minority communities, and the churches in the South. It is the coalition building that has begun there, which I think spells success in the South. And then starting to get the first pastors in the South which we have a great one who's leading an organization in Mississippi now, to come out in support of his LGBT family. So, you know, they're way behind. And they need your help. You know, I mean, they need your help on things like making sure that we get legislation put in place, an omnibus, all-inclusive piece of legislation in front of the federal government that at least gives them the promise for not just housing and not just education, or not just employment, but also education throughout the South and at the federal level. So it's not just going to apply to those of us living in these privileged areas, but to these people in the South. Give them that message of hope. And I know it sounds unreasonable, but it really would be a symbol of hope for them.
You know, I think that last point about sort of comprehensive legislation begs the question of, let's look at other movements that came before us and what was successful for them, and what have they not done well. So I'd love all of you, feel free to jump in on this. As we're at this unique moment, we're trying to think about what's next. We're going to your point. Everyone wants to know what's next, what's next. What can we learn from other movements, whether it's the fight for civil rights or voting rights or women's rights, reproductive justice? What can we learn from them? And what can we learn from sort of turning an inward eye, looking at our own movement and our roots of our movement, which existed before marriage equality? What can we learn from that? What do you hope we take away? That's a big question.
I mean, I'm happy to talk politically a little bit, but I mean, I go back. I had the great opportunity to cause a lot of trouble about 6 years ago when me and a guy named Chad Griffin had this idea to go hire Ted Olson and David Boies to sue the state of California in federal court, and I caught hell, right? And I didn't catch hell from the religious right or conservatives, but I caught hell from the gay leadership at the time. And one of the amazing things that happens if you get one of those little gold Oscar trophies is you get to meet a lot of your heroes, and one of my great heroes is a guy named Julian Bond. People know who Julian Bond is? Yeah. You know, great hero of the Black Civil Rights Movement, led the NAACP forever, and I said, hey, I don't want to screw this up. We don't want to screw this up. Is it too soon to take this fight to the federal government? You know, I'll never forget it. He said, Lance, good things do not come to those who wait. They come to those who agitate. And I was like, wow. Right. You know, and this is where I think it's critical as a movement to pay attention to the history of our brothers and sisters of the civil rights movement. You have to do it now. I mean, Martin Luther King said that from a jail in Birmingham. His whole life he had heard wait, and that always meant never. You got to do it now, and you got to do it at the federal level, so that those of us who have the resources, when we win our equality, those wins don't just apply to California or to Chicago or to New York. Those wins apply at the federal level, and they apply to our brothers and sisters down south as well.
But yeah, the thing for me is I can't help but think about how, 50 years after the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Acts were signed into law, that we still have things like what's happening in Ferguson. For black folks, that even though we have anti-discrimination policy in place for people of color and for women, that we still are living in a misogynist, patriarchal state, that we're still living in a white supremacist state, that black and brown folks are being profiled by the police disproportionately, are still disproportionately living in poverty. So that the policy piece is crucial, but there's something that's happening around stigma and around the hearts and minds piece that Jason's talking about, that is not enough to have policies in place, that we also have to change how we think and how we act and treat each other, or the policy actually doesn't matter, or there will be folks in the Supreme Court with the Voting Rights Act who will gut that, and then states all of a sudden passing these prohibitive voter suppression laws. So there's a larger issue of changing hearts and minds and moving stigma away from various identities. I think that's crucial.
I'm sitting between two people who are absolutely doing that, and it's, I think, in sports and in film, and certainly as we're talking about movies and television, having diversity that is reflective of the real world in the writer's room and as the directors is critical.
No, I'm so proud of one of my first executive producing project that has made it to television is going to be premiering on Friday. It's called Laverne Cox Presents the Keyword. It's premiering on MTV and Logo at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, and it takes a look at the lives of 7 young people between the ages of 12 and 24 who are trans. And it's a diverse group of folks in terms of socioeconomic background and race and gender. And what I'm so proud of is because I do believe that the media can play a really important role. I think for trans folks, especially because a lot of, as you said, a lot of folks, say they know LGBT people, very few people say they know someone who is trans across this country. So media becomes really important, and how we tell trans stories in the media become really, really crucial in terms of changing hearts and minds and lifting stigma. So I'm really proud to have been, and it was challenging being a Black trans woman in a decision-making, position at, this big, TV network. But having been involved in that process, my presence there, not only as a Black trans woman, but as a trans woman who has an oppositional worldview, was crucial in the decision-making processes about how we told these young people's stories. I'm so proud of them. I hope you all tune in. They're really courageous. And it's still funny. I love that you were talking about coming out, because as a trans person, it is still a tremendously courageous act to come forward and say that you're transgender when you can be murdered just for walking down the street with someone who realizes you're trans. So these 7 young people are so brave and courageous, and I love them. I think that's the thing.
And Lance, we're talking a little bit about your next project. I mean, can you give anybody who has a sneak preview of sort of what you're thinking about in terms of all these movements and how they fit together?
Yeah, can I say one more thing? Because I'm a brat and I have all these ideas. But I think that because I feel like I'm leaving one piece out a little bit, which is we talked about legislation that could protect, but certainly culture to change hearts and minds to actually make it easier to get that legislation done and to certainly make people safer. In the meantime, we're in this strange place where we don't have a lot of protections in a lot of the country. Our culture is saying, come out. Young people are doing it. And they're more in harm's way than ever in some ways. And so it's making sure that we have the safety nets in place. I'm so proud of this organization for doing that. Making sure that we have that on a national level as well. That each city these young people might go to, there's a place for them to call home and a place for them to lay their head. But also making sure that we're keeping our national hotlines open for young LGBT people in crisis. Because until we have all 435 congressional districts free and equal in hearts and minds changed, we need those safety nets. All right. The thing I'm working on is called. I had this really cool experience, which was very different than Milk. Milk was really hard to get made, and that started about 8 years ago. Just going from studio to studio, no one wanted to do it. This is even after Brokeback Mountain and its financial success. They didn't want to do it with the gay man as the lead. They're like, make Diane Feinstein. It doesn't make any sense. Make it Dan White, someone said. And so, it was a lot of work, and it took a lot of packaging to finally get it financed. But about a year ago, a little bit less, ABC came to me and said, hey, I think we need to do Gay Roots now, or it'll be too late. We'll have missed the boat. And I said, yeah, I think that's true. I think you need to do it now. And so what I've crafted is about this sort of interconnectivity of civil rights movements, which is, at this point, it's called When We Rise, and it's about the confluence of the Black civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the peace movement right around 1971, and how a few of the young leaders from those movements came together in a city called San Francisco and created this fast-moving LGBT movement.
When's it out? Do you know?
It should be next summer.
Okay. So we'll look for it. Jason, you were going to hop in at some point, and I don't know if we lost the thread.
I think everybody touched on it, but just continuing to try also, because the church has so much, a wide effect on so many people, just trying to constantly put pressure or to aid them to evolve and think We were talking earlier about even as recently as earlier this week with the Pope changing his tone, and I think that's a really great sign that people's hearts and minds are starting to change.
So we've heard from all of you, and I'm sensitive to the time, but we've heard from all of you about the tremendous need that exists in our communities all over the country. So I want to ask you, what is the one thing that keeps you up at night? Not who keeps you up at night, the one thing, issue that keeps you up at night and drives you to do this work. This is going to get scandalous quickly, but please.
I sit here today, and my acting coach, Brad Calcaterra, says to say the first thing that comes to your mind. And Alon Nettles has been on my mind. Last Friday, October 10th, she would have been 23 years old. But on August 17th of 2013, she was walking down the street. Walking down the street is often a contested act for trans people, particularly trans people of color. And she was walking with a friend of hers. It was catcalled by a group of young men. And one of them realized she was trans, and she was beaten into a coma. And 5 days later, she died. Over a year later, there's yet to be an arrest for the murder of Alon Nettles. Far too often, the homicides of trans people go unsolved. And since she was slain, over 12 trans people have been murdered since then. So, but for the grace of God, I could be Alon Nettles. So for me, that is why I continue to use my voice. That is why I do the work for people like Alon Nettles who are no longer with us, and for trans people like Cece McDonald, who fought for her life on the streets of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and her gift for surviving, which so many of us don't, was a prison sentence. For Isha Love, who right here in Chicago. To get away from one of her attackers. They're trans people literally fighting for their lives all over this country. Videos went viral this summer of trans women of color fighting for their lives, and folks use it as entertainment. So that is what keeps me saying what I say and involved in this work.
Jason, what about you?
What keeps me up is knowing that there are other athletes out there. I always look to the sports community, and again, so proud of what Tom did, but there are many athletes that I'm in contact with, and I never tell someone what they should do. I just tell them, like, if you choose to come forward, your life is going to be so much better. And my role on the team, I started out, hot rookie, coming into the league, and then my second year I'm a starter in the NBA Finals, going up against Tim Duncan and David Robinson, being a starter for midway through my career. But then for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been that veteran on the end of the bench that, if there's a problem, he'll play. If there's somebody gets in foul trouble, go out there and play. But my role is sort of to be the mentor, to be that solid veteran that teaches the young guys this is how you have a double-digit NBA career. And sort of just an evolution of that role now, where just being that mentor for so many young athletes who are still in the closet I'm in contact with, and also with those of us who do come out, just letting them know there's sort of like a fraternity. There's a brotherhood now. I'm friends with Billy Bean from baseball, and Wade Davis from football, and Derek Gordon from college basketball, who's now out, and Michael Sam. There's just so many of us, Robbie Rogers, the list goes on and on of just staying in contact with each other, because it goes back to sort of that support system, because we have so many similar stories, and then trying to aid that next generation, to encourage them again to live their authentic life. And it keeps me, it gives me hope, though. It's not like something that's worrisome, but it's like hope that there's work to be done, because they should be out, they should be living their life openly. And there's no better feeling than playing a game against the Miami Heat last year in the playoffs, and after the game, my boyfriend's waiting for me in the family room, just like everyone else's loved ones are, and that's how it should be.
Thanks for that.
What keeps me up at night? I mean, things like this. I grew up a really shy kid. My mom took me to kindergarten, and I set in like a panic attack when I saw all these little kids' faces look up at me. And I spent like the first 2 years with the principal because I couldn't be around kids. So I was really, painfully shy. So this stuff is hard for me. But I also, my mom's voice in my ear, and as much as we bash the Mormon Church, and for good reason, there's also a lot of good that came out of it. And one thing my good Mormon mom taught me was that if you see a problem, and boy do I see a problem, and I can see myself and so many of these young kids out there who are feeling the same way I did so many years ago. So if you see a problem and you see a solution, and as a student of history, not just LGBT history, but other civil rights movements, if you study our history, there's a lot of solutions for these problems we have today. We've been through some of these things before in different incarnations. So if you see a problem and you see a solution, do you have a responsibility, even if it scares the crap out of you, to act? And my mom would say, heck yes you do. Get out there and fix it. And so it keeps me up at night because I know I've seen problems and I have some visions for solutions. And I know I got to get out there and fix it, even if it means getting up there and sweating in front of you and disappointing my agents because I'm not busy writing screenplays.
So I think that's a great place to end, which is on solutions, right? And I would love to hear from each of you. What is one thing that people in this room can do? I'm going to take one of your options because one of the things that you can do is obviously support Chicago House. So this is the part where I point out the envelopes that are on your table, and you all awkwardly look at each other and figure out who's actually going to write another check or not. But it's there, so please consider giving. Because Lance, as you said, the work that Stan, you and your team do is so important here. And it's not just the impact you have in Chicago, it's the example you set for the rest of the country too. So this is so important. But what are 3 more things that folks can do? You have 500 well-connected, passionate people in this room. What can they do? Just one thing.
Besides giving, God, but these aren't sure. I think coalition building is one of the most important things as a movement we can do. I think one of the worst diseases in the LGBT movement is myopia, right? And it's not just going to say the black movement or to the religious communities and saying, hey, notice me, approve of me, love me. It's going to them and saying, hey guys, we make fabulous banners and we do some amazing shit. How can we help you? We can contribute to your congregation. We can show up when you're being denied your rights in Ferguson, and it's to start to build the collaborations that Harvey Milk called the coalition of the Us's that have really, I think, suffered from myopia. And I think getting out there and building those coalitions is going to be helpful.
It's great. I love that.
For me, it would be around that. I think for me, it's about critically interrogating our positionalities and being able to ask ourselves very difficult questions about how we're located, how our work is being informed by cis women, patriarchy. And in that interrogation, ask ourselves, how can we act differently? And how can we act differently? That's what I would say.
Along the same lines, we're all on the same team together here, and it's not just the people in the spotlight. Let's make sure that we can bring more people under the service tent and look out for each other.
For not just being role models, but I like the term possibility models too, for anyone in this room, and certainly for next generation of folks who are going to be following. I'll turn it back over to Stan.
So they were perfect, and actually Gautum, who we didn't hear enough from, is also perfect. As we were walking out of the green room, I said, if we don't have honest conversations about race, about gender identity, about all of this stuff, then we might as well not walk out onto the stage. And they did exactly that, and they did it in a way that was just so respectful and lovely, and I'm so grateful. In closing, I want to take us back to the table at the time where Chicago House was founded, as mostly gay men with open chaos lesions on their faces were being forced to the streets in homelessness. It was a combination of LGBTQ and a combination of straight people, but a combination of people who knew that it had to get better. And from the start, we were founded as three things. We were founded as LGBTQ, we were founded as HIV and AIDS, and we were founded as poverty. And thank God we're still all three of those things. But if you have money and you're LGBTQ, you're going to never need Chicago House. And if you have money in this day and age and you have HIV and AIDS, you're never going to need Chicago House. But if you're poor and you have HIV and AIDS, or you're LGBTQ, or you're not LGBTQ, we're not doing a good enough job of taking care of one another. And this conversation up here is the start to that same conversation that we had at the baton. And so I thank you for being here, and I ask for your continued support as we reach out to exactly those communities. So thank you, and thank all of you so much.